They called them schools, but behind the fences lay something darker. What if I told you thousands of Native children were taken by force, stripped of their names, and buried in secret graves no one spoke of for a century? From forced haircuts to hidden cemeteries and the chilling motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." These institutions weren't just classrooms. They were factories of cultural erasure that left scars we still feel today. Stay with me, because the truth about Indian boarding schools is more shocking, more heartbreaking, and more important than you've ever imagined. Chapter 1. Why were Indian schools created? Long before most people even heard the term boarding school, a plan was already unfolding. Imagine a government plotting to erase entire cultures, using classrooms as their chosen weapon. In the late 1800s, the United States faced a question many politicians called the Indian problem. Colonial expansion was swallowing tribal lands. Railroads carved up territories once reserved by treaty. But what no one said aloud was that the ultimate goal was cultural annihilation. Instead of endless war, federal leaders decided to target the next generation: Native children. This idea wasn't just theory. In 1879, Captain Richard Henry Pratt, a former Army officer, founded the first federally funded off-reservation boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His motto was blunt: "Kill the Indian, save the man." Pratt believed that if you removed children from their families and stripped away language, dress, and ceremony, you could make them civilized. By 1900, more than 20,000 Native children were enrolled in boarding schools across the United States. Some institutions were run by missionaries, others by the government. All shared one goal: total assimilation. Legislation like the Dawes Act of 1887 split communal lands into individual plots. Any land deemed surplus was sold off, nearly 90 million acres lost forever. In the same breath, federal agents began issuing compulsory attendance orders. If parents refused to send children, rations were cut off or they were threatened with jail. Missionary groups saw this as a righteous mission. A Presbyterian educator boasted in 1891, "These little savages must be tamed or the Republic cannot endure." If you think this was a fringe policy, consider this. By 1925, more than 60,000 children were in these schools. Many would never see their families again. And if you stay with me, I'll show you exactly what happened the moment those children stepped off the trains. Some called it progress, but for thousands of families, it felt more like an official kidnapping signed in Washington ink. Chapter 2. What happened when kids arrived? Try to picture it. A train screeching into an unfamiliar town, dozens of children stepping onto frozen platforms. What would it feel like to lose your language and your name in a single afternoon? For many kids, the first hours inside an Indian school were the most traumatic of their lives. At Carlisle, arrival meant a total stripping of identity. Hair, so sacred in many nations, was cut off immediately. Lakota children wept as braids were thrown into piles. One boy remembered thinking, "My power was in my hair," and they took it. Uniforms replaced homemade clothing. Girls were stuffed into stiff cotton dresses. Boys wore scratchy military jackets and trousers. If you refused, staff used force. In 1884, Zitkala Shah, a Dakota writer, described hiding under a bed, only to be dragged out by her arms and shorn bald. Names were changed on the spot. Oglala, childbearer Paints himself, became Peter. Navajo girl Tse Delision was assigned Mary. Administrators kept ledger books, crossing out Native names with thick black ink. One Carlisle teacher wrote, "The Indian must forget he was ever anything else." Dormitories were laid out like barracks, rows of iron beds, no privacy, no familiar faces. At night, children cried themselves to sleep, voices echoing off brick walls. Meals were foreign, boiled beef and stale bread, nothing like hominy or bison stew. If a child spoke their language, they were slapped or had their mouth scrubbed with lye soap. Some kids never left those grounds alive. If you stay with me, I'll show you what they were taught inside those classrooms and why education often felt like war. Among the Lakota, it was said, "The first night in white man's clothes, you are not yourself anymore." Chapter 3. What were they taught? Imagine spending every day being told your culture was backward, your language shameful, your family unfit to raise you. What exactly did Indian schools teach? And why was the price of learning so high? Classes were split between academics and manual labor. Every morning, children recited English prayers and memorized lessons about American heroes. A typical day at Carlisle or Haskell included reading, arithmetic, and geography. But history was rewritten. Teachers called native homelands wilderness, and tribal leaders savages. One Carlisle instructor wrote in 1902, "It is necessary to uproot primitive pride." Afternoons were spent working. Boys learned blacksmithing, carpentry, and shoemaking, skills meant to transform them into cheap laborers. Girls were drilled in sewing, cooking, and laundering. At Haskell Institute, teenage girls prepared meals for 500 people daily, their hands raw from scrubbing cast iron pots. Religion was mandatory. Catholic, Presbyterian, and Methodist services filled Sundays. One student recalled, "They told us our spirits were lost unless we accepted Jesus." The curriculum looked like progress on paper. In reality, it was designed to erase heritage. Children were forbidden from speaking their own languages. When they slipped, punishments were immediate: extra chores, public shaming, or worse. Yet some children resisted. Navajo girls quietly stitched sacred patterns into uniforms. Lakota boys carved traditional symbols under school desks. Secret acts of defiance no teacher could fully stamp out. By 1903, Carlisle claimed 90% of its graduates were self-sufficient, but many left school only to find they were strangers to their families and unwelcome in white society. If you stay with me, I'll show you how discipline in these schools often crossed the line into pure cruelty. One survivor said, "They taught me how to read, but they also taught me how to hate myself." Chapter 4. How did they punish children? Imagine being 7 years old, alone in a concrete cell for speaking your mother tongue. How far would adults go to break a child's spirit in the name of civilization? Punishment was the backbone of the Indian boarding school system. Administrators believed fear was the fastest way to erase culture. At Carlisle, children caught using native words were lined up and beaten with leather straps. A government report in 1928 confirmed this, describing corporal punishment administered to enforce discipline. Isolation was common. At Chilocco Indian School, records detail how children were locked in dark closets or basement cells for days. Food was withheld, water sometimes limited to a single cup. One child testified decades later, "I was so hungry I tried to eat my own shirt." Milder infractions, like forgetting English prayers, meant hours of extra chores. Girls were ordered to scrub wooden floors until their knees bled. Boys shoveled coal until their fingers cracked in winter cold. Teachers used humiliation as a weapon. Some forced children to wear signs reading, "I am a liar," or "I am dirty." One Hopi boy remembered being paraded through the dining hall wearing only a sheet after he wet the bed. In Canadian residential schools, electric chairs were used as punishment. While U.S. records don't confirm that practice here, survivors consistently describe beatings severe enough to leave scars decades later. Government inspectors knew. In 1928, the Merriam Report admitted, "The schools are grossly inadequate and contribute to ill health and misery." If you stay with me, I'll show you the darkest part of this system, the hidden cemeteries no one dared to speak about. Many elders said they buried the children twice, once in the ground, and again by forgetting their names. Chapter 5. Where are the missing children? Imagine sending your child away to school and never seeing them again. What if no one ever told you where their body was buried? Behind the manicured lawns and brick buildings of many boarding schools were secret graveyards. At Carlisle, more than 200 children died between 1879 and 1918. Their graves were marked with wooden crosses that rotted over time. Some parents never even received a letter. Tuberculosis swept through overcrowded dorms. Measles, influenza, and malnutrition killed thousands more. One 1908 report from the Phoenix Indian School recorded 47 deaths in a single outbreak. School officials often blamed childhood weakness, but survivors told a different story. They spoke of sickness untreated, children forced to work while feverish, and food so scarce they stole scraps from pig troughs. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar found 215 unmarked graves at Canada's Kamloops Indian Residential School. That discovery sparked a reckoning, but American schools had similar cemeteries. The U.S. Department of the Interior later confirmed over 500 deaths across the first 19 schools it investigated, and that review is still unfinished. One Carlisle superintendent wrote bluntly in 1905, "We will not notify the parents unless necessary. It only encourages them to interfere." When bodies were returned, coffins sometimes contained the wrong remains, or no remains at all. Records were lost, names misspelled, grave markers moved or destroyed. Some tribes now fight to bring their children home. In 2017, the Northern Arapaho Nation reclaimed the bodies of Little Chief, Horse, and Little Plume after 134 years at Carlisle. If you stay with me, I'll explain why so many families felt forced to comply, even when their hearts were breaking. A Cheyenne elder once said, "They took our children's bodies, but they also tried to bury our memory." Chapter 6. Why did families comply? Imagine knowing your child might vanish, but feeling powerless to say no. Why did so many families comply when every instinct told them to resist? The answer wasn't weakness, it was survival. Federal agents enforced compulsory attendance laws passed in the 1890s. If parents refused, rations were withheld. Sometimes entire communities were starved into compliance. A 1903 Bureau of Indian Affairs memo bluntly stated, "Food incentives will be the most effective leverage to obtain attendance." In the Hopi Mesas, families hid children in caves when government wagons approached. When discovered, parents were arrested. In 1894, 19 Hopi men were shackled and sent to Alcatraz for interfering with school operations. Navajo families traveled hundreds of miles to retrieve their children. One mother walked from Chinle to Fort Defiance, a 200-mile round trip, only to be turned away at the gates. Missionaries told parents that schools were the only way to prevent their children from being declared wards of the state. If you resisted, authorities threatened to place your child in white foster homes. Fear wasn't the only force. Some parents hoped education would help their children survive a world that had already stolen their land and herds. It was a grim calculus. Better to lose a language than to starve. A Lakota grandmother remembered thinking, "If I keep him here, he will grow hungry. If I send him, he will grow lonely. Which is worse?" Yet even when children were sent away, families fought to preserve culture. Mothers whispered prayers over their heads before they left. Fathers tucked medicine bundles into coat linings. Every small act said, "You belong to us, no matter what they teach you. If you stay with me, I'll show you what happened when the children risked everything to come home." Among the Hopi, it was said, "Better a child returned in rags than never returned at all." Chapter 7. How did they resist? Picture a moonless night and a child slipping past the watchman, barefoot on frozen ground. How far would you run to get back to your mother? Runaways were a constant threat to the system. At Carlisle, school records documented over 100 escapes in a single year. Sometimes children fled in groups, hiding by day and walking all night. In 1891, 47 Apache children broke out of Fort Marion. Only a handful made it home alive. Teachers called them defiant, but for many, escape was the only way to protect identity. A Navajo boy recounted, "I ran because every morning I forgot my grandmother's voice." Resistance wasn't only in fleeing. Inside the schools, children practiced quiet rebellions. Lakota girls stitched secret beadwork patterns into their collars, symbols of prayers they were forbidden to say. Boys carved clan marks into the undersides of desks and bed frames. At Chilocco Indian School, hunger strikes erupted. In 1920, dozens of students refused meals to protest spoiled food and beatings. One report from the Bureau of Indian Affairs admitted they are incorrigible in their attachment to tribal ways. Teachers tried to break solidarity. Runaways, when caught, were publicly humiliated. Some had their heads shaved again or were locked in punishment cells. Yet the escapes never stopped. Among the Northern Cheyenne, families sometimes hid runaways in wagon loads of hay or dressed them as younger siblings to smuggle them home. A school matron complained, "Every time I turn my back, some savage slips away into the dark." But many children were caught and forced to stay until graduation. which often meant age 18. If you stay with me, I'll show you what happened when they finally left, and why freedom wasn't always what they expected. A Lakota elder said, "Running was dangerous, but staying could kill your spirit." Chapter 8. What was life after graduation? Imagine surviving years of forced labor, punishments, and isolation, only to discover you belong nowhere. What did freedom look like after Indian boarding school? For many, it was a cruel contradiction. Graduates were told they were civilized, but most were sent straight into indentured labor. Government contracts placed boys on farms and ranches across the Midwest. Girls were assigned to white families as domestic servants, cooking, cleaning, and caring for children who sometimes called them savage maids. Records from Carlisle show that by 1910, over 2,000 students were working off-site under apprenticeship agreements. The pay was often withheld by school administrators, supposedly for safekeeping. Few ever saw a cent. Some tried to use their education to build new lives. Charles Eastman, a Santee Dakota graduate, became a physician and author. But he was the exception. Most returned home as strangers, unable to speak their language fluently or follow traditional ways. One woman from the Omaha tribe said, "I went home and my own grandmother wept because I could not answer her in our tongue." Rejection was common. Communities sometimes distrusted those who came back wearing Western clothes and carrying Christian Bibles. Meanwhile, white society refused to treat them as equals. By 1930, less than 10% of boarding school graduates owned land or businesses. Many ended up in poverty or working menial jobs in cities. Survivors carried invisible scars. Some never taught their own children their language, fearing it would bring more shame or punishment. If you stay with me, I'll show you how this experiment in assimilation rippled through generations, shaping not just individual lives but entire nations. A Cheyenne elder once said, "They taught us to read, but left us nowhere to belong." Chapter 9. How did Indian schools shape modern America? Think about this. An entire generation forced to forget who they were, then expected to build a future from nothing. What did that do to families and to the country itself? The impact of Indian boarding schools didn't end when the gates closed. Decades of cultural suppression tore apart kinship systems. By the 1970s, nearly 1 in 3 Native children had been removed from their homes, either to boarding schools or non-Native foster families. Generational trauma became woven into daily life. Studies show Native Americans have 2.5 times higher rates of PTSD than the general population. Suicide rates are more than twice the national average for Native youth. Alcohol and substance abuse skyrocketed, often tracing back to the isolation and shame planted in boarding school years. The Dawes Act and forced assimilation also stripped communities of nearly 90 million acres of land. This land loss broke economies that had sustained people for thousands of years. By 1934, the U.S. government finally admitted that allotment had failed, but the damage was irreversible. Despite this, survivors began reclaiming what was stolen. Language revitalization programs took root in the 1970s. Tribes like the Cherokee and Ojibwe launched immersion schools to teach children their ancestral tongue. In 1978, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act to stop wholesale removal of Native children. It was the first formal recognition that the government's policies had nearly erased entire cultures. One survivor testified to Congress, "You call it education. I call it genocide by paper and prayer." If you stay with me, I'll show you how communities today are turning survival into healing, and why remembering these stories matters now more than ever. Among the Lakota, elders say, "A broken hoop can be mended, but only if you see where it cracked." Chapter 10. What should we remember today? Imagine growing up with stories of grandparents whose childhoods were stolen by schools that claimed to save them. How do you heal wounds that were buried for generations? Today, the reckoning is finally underway. In 2017, the Northern Arapaho reclaimed the remains of 3 boys, Little Chief, Horse, and Little Plume, from the Carlisle Cemetery. Families traveled over 1,500 miles to bring their children home. As their caskets were lowered into Wyoming soil, elders sang songs that had once been banned. In 2021, the Department of the Interior launched the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. The first report documented 408 schools and 53 burial sites, but experts believe hundreds more remain uncounted. Deb Haaland, the first Native American cabinet secretary, said, "We are uncovering the truth of what was done to us. We will not be silent anymore." Communities are rebuilding languages once nearly erased. The Cherokee Nation's immersion schools have graduated hundreds of fluent speakers, children who greet each day in the language their great-grandparents were beaten for using. Survivors now stand on stages and testify to what they endured, publicly reclaiming stories long buried in shame. One elder said, "I am not a victim. I am the last child who remembers, so you will never forget." Reconciliation is not just about apologies. It is about returning land, honoring treaties, and funding tribal-led education. It means teaching every child in America what boarding schools really were. If you stayed with me this far, you know these histories can't stay hidden. When you remember the names, when you learn the truth, you become part of the healing. Among the Ojibwe, it is said, "Stories are medicine. If you carry them, you help the people survive." If this opened your eyes, subscribe now and share this story. Comment what moved you most. Together, let's honor the voices that refuse to be silenced. More truths are coming.